Good evening, everyone. I'm Alexandra Fallon. I'm the Carmel Public Library Foundation Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome you to our 10th annual fundraising event, the Futurist Edition with Parag Khanna. We're very excited to have you here in this beautiful theater, and we also want to welcome everyone who is live streaming with us online as well. Tonight, we're so grateful to our esteemed speaker and acclaimed author, Parag Khanna, for also helping us navigate and understand the complexities of our time. Like many of our programs throughout the year, this presentation will hopefully raise our collective consciousness and help seed further thoughtful discourse in the tradition of Carmel's renowned literary and cultural ancestors. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our Carmel Public Library Foundation Board President, Marcy Moe.
Thank you, Alexandria. Good evening, everyone. Sometimes locals refer to life in Carmel by the sea as living in a bubble. It is easy to go about our day and enjoy all of the natural beauty that surrounds us and stay somewhat insulated. In fact, many of us relocate here for a respite, a slower pace. But what is also true of our community is that there is a strong thirst for learning, knowledge, and connectivity. It is evident in our community programs attendance, in our library's circulation statistics, and in the abundance of interesting lectures and events available in the region. With that in mind, along with all of the complex global concerns, choosing to contemplate our future for this year's event seemed obvious, but finding someone who could provide context for all of the converging factors was not. We're delighted to have found Parag Khanna, a global strategic futurist based in Singapore. He is prominent in his field, an acclaimed author, and a dynamic speaker with over 3 million views on TED Talks. Dr. John Arquilla, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Defense Analysis at the United States Naval Postgraduate School, acclaimed author, and one of America's foremost experts of global strategy, says this about our speaker tonight. Parag Khanna has one of the most creative minds in the world today and an ability to see through all the conflicts and complexity the path ahead to prosperity and peace. Please join me in welcoming Parag Khanna.
Thank you so much, Marcy. Thank you, Alexandra. And thanks to all of you for this very, very generous welcome to Carmel. And being here really beats Zoom, I have to say. I heard Alexandra refer to Carmel as a village, and it struck me that, of course, it's much more than just a village. You are a guardian of this incredible geography, this mighty coastline that's so profoundly symbolic, obviously, of American history in so many ways, and the achievement of this continental scale of the United States. So I can't help but think in those terms when this afternoon I went out for a jog around, Scenic Drive, and it's just mind-bending, right? Mesmerizing. So you're all so lucky to live here, and I'm very lucky and honored privileged to be with you this evening. So I mentioned geography a moment ago, and that's certainly the topic that's nearest and dearest to my heart. That's where I want to begin this conversation this evening, and I hope it will very much be a conversation. So I'll try and zip through my slides and maps more than anything else, and really looking forward to our dialogue this evening. So first and foremost, actually, when I talk about geography these days, I don't just mean one geography. I mean geographies, plural. And you don't often hear about geography in the plural. And this is where it's kind of the point of departure for this book, is thinking about how there are really 4 active layers of geography. And I want to talk about each of them briefly, but start with the end in mind in the message that these four layers are very, very badly misaligned. They're very much out of sync. And a lot of the disruption, complexity, unpredictability in the world today stems from the fact that we have these misaligned geographies and we're not grasping the need to realign them. And that's the agenda that I'm going to nudge us towards over the course of my presentation. So the first of the four layers is natural geography, of course, the Earth as we have inherited it, as we find it, so to speak. And a lot of people take a map like this as a very static image of the world. And this is, of course, what we think of when we think of geography. We sort of take it for granted. But now we know we can't do that anymore, right? We know that even though we agree on the colors, right? Blue for the oceans, green for the forests, white for the ice, and brown for the deserts, right? Except even within that, you have, because of climate change, of course, you have rising sea levels. That means more blue, deforestation, less green, desertification, more brown, melting of the polar ice caps, less white, right? There is a constant churn underway at an accelerating rate from any time that, of course, we have lived through. And this, of course, impacts and influences human life, and it influences all of the other geographies as well. And that's what we're learning right now. So the second layer, the one that we're most familiar with, another layer that we tend to take for granted and we hold to be static. This is the map of political geography. And this is the map that hangs in every classroom and every office all over the world. But here too, I think we're far too wedded to a static picture, and we assume that, well, this is the way it should be because this is the way it is. And we almost have, again, taken nature for granted. We take politics for granted. Now, this map, however, is actually by far the most arbitrary of all of them, right? Because none of us built these borders, right? We didn't create these borders. We inherited them. And actually, they're changing all the time. We paint these pictures and we hold them to be sacred, as states and nations often do in terms of their nationalism and identity. But actually, again, in 1945, when the United Nations was founded, there were only 51 countries, and today there are 200. So clearly the lines aren't really as sacred and immutable and permanent as people would like to believe. And of course, as we're witnessing tragically right now between Russia and Ukraine, there are still many unsettled borders in the world. And an unsettled border is a border that is likely to become a violent dispute. And the places in the world that are peaceful are not surprisingly the places where the borders are more or less settled. Now, climate change, again, the first map, is going to influence this map. Whether or not people can even live in certain countries, whether or not it's even worth living in certain countries, will be affected by climate change. And that's just the complex dynamics between two of our four layers. Now I'll get to the third one, which is called functional geography. Not a term most people are necessarily familiar with, but this is the geography of infrastructure, the built environment, connectivity, for example. Here I'm mapping out all of the world's highways, railways, oil and gas pipelines, internet cables. And interestingly, this is not a map that hangs on any of your walls or offices. They hang in mine because I love this stuff. And I'm happy to have you download them off my website and use them. But what I find important about this map is that this is a map that we actually built. We should celebrate this map. This should be the map that hangs in our classrooms and offices. We spend, as humanity, about $4 trillion a year actively building this, transcending, overcoming those arbitrary political divides, right? All of that connectivity that makes global supply chains, the world economy, that makes global society a whole greater than the sum of its parts. That's a great accomplishment. That's what this map does. And we've committed enormous energy, particularly in the last 7,500 years, to building this map. And this is by far the fastest changing because of all of that expenditure, all of that, think about just about urbanization, right? Building up our cities and the mega cities in the world today. And so this too, of course, profoundly shapes the relations between countries. Just look, for example, at European energy markets. A country like Germany declared in 2000 2011, after the Fukushima nuclear incident, that it was going to phase out nuclear power. But thanks to its neighbor France producing lots of nuclear power, it imports French nuclear power through the power lines that you can see on this map. Think about the high-speed railways that you ride on when you zip across Europe and so forth. And think about all the internet cables. How would we be able to have been living on Zoom the last couple of years and having these, for many of us who have been fortunate enough to kind of have a seamless professional continuity, it's all because of the infrastructure that we built. So this changes so much about our daily lives, and we don't appreciate it because we don't map it. And that's the third layer. And the fourth and final layer, really of many, of course, but I think you can reduce so many of our frameworks around the world fit them into one of these kind of four images. The fourth one, it might be the most important of all for us. It's the map of us. It's human geography, right? It's our distribution around the world. Actually, human geography is much more than just where we are. Human geography is actually something very anthropological and evolutionary. It's also why we are where we are, and the composition of societies in terms of gender, ethnography, and so forth. And I see there are some students here I hope have studied AP Human Geography. Raise your hand if you have. Hooray, yes? Good. Most very, very important subject. AP Human Geography is a relatively new addition to the AP sort of canon. And it's quickly become one of the most popular ones. There's a famous saying that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. But now the more and more young Americans are studying geography and human geography, and I think that is very, very promising. So here's the geography of us, right? And maps like this I find profoundly significant. There are 8 billion pixels showing the distribution of every human being. I'll show you a different version of this in a moment. But of course, why are we where we are? Well, it most certainly has a lot to do with the map of physical, natural geography, a lot to do with the map of political geography as well, right? What are the borders that we can and can't cross? What are the environmental conditions where we can and can't survive? So what I find when I said at the beginning that it's not just about the layers of geography, it's the complex interplay and the fact that these are misaligned, right? So because we don't create maps that show all of these layers together, overlapping, we fail to understand just how complex the world has become and how these layers affect each other. And I don't think that you can actually understand many things that are happening in the world today unless you're looking at a map that brings all of these layers together. So you can see what is connected to what affects what, who is affected where. It's pretty simple as a thought process, and it quickly becomes so complicated, though, that you can't necessarily grasp cause and effect unless you map it. And so I try to produce these composites in a way. But let me get to the part about complexity. That's what I want to get at here and tie it to the theme about human geography and the future of human geography and mobility. Because if you go back about 100,000 years, let's say, since humankind began wandering out of Africa and populating the continents, and you were to categorize all of the reasons why people have moved, why have we wound up where we are? Why are those 8 billion pixels distributed as they are? As I said, there'll be many, many, many reasons. But generally speaking, you could break them down into roughly these 5 kind of categories. The first, actually, starting at the bottom of the top square, climate change, right? After the retreat of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, that's when population started to shift further north. There have been periods of glacial retreat in some areas that have made geographies habitable. Of course, certain places have warmed. Agriculture, we've settled along, obviously, rivers and coastlines and so forth. So the climate has driven where we've lived. Political upheaval. Again, you can obviously go back thousands of years to the expulsion of religious groups and communities. You can look at more modern history, world wars, genocides, partitions, the Holocaust, and so forth. Political upheavals have been a driver of where people live and where people move. Demographic imbalances have been very significant. That's simply the gap between old and young. If you look at the mass migrations of immigrants into the United States in the 60s, in particular 50s, 60s, 70s, and in Europe, into Europe roughly the same time in the post-war decades, it has a lot to do with labor shortages, simply. So the likes that, similar to what we're facing today, though today it might even be more acute than it was back then. So the gap between old and young within countries and across them is has certain gravitational pulls that affect where people live and how people move. Economic dislocation. Think about the financial crisis, or more broadly, the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt of the United States, and that has driven a lot of people from north to south and from east to west in the United States. Technological disruptions, so automation of factory work goes hand in hand with the economic dislocation, but also positive things like Zoom and remote work. Now you don't have to live near your office and commute. You can live anywhere you want. So technological disruptions enable mobility. So you can take these buckets or categories. These are all reasons why people move or relocate or have over time. You can, again, bring in more. Pandemics are another reason, for example. And what has changed, or what has amplified all of these drivers of mobility, is connectivity itself, right? The fact that it's easier to move. We have the technology, we've evolved technologically such that, unlike thousands of years ago, of course, you can get on a plane, you can take a train, a ferry, whatever the case may be, and you can literally physically relocate. So the capacity for humans to move is more powerful, of course, than it's ever been. Of course, in the meantime, we can, there are certain people who want to colonize Mars. So getting on Earth is not really that hard anymore, such that we're extending our frontier. So this is a very simple formula that I've created, but if you add it all up, right, you take these drivers of mobility and multiply it by connectivity, you get a world in which we are likely to experience accelerated mobility. Now, I drew up this kind of scheme sort of right as COVID was breaking out. So it seemed like it was a fairly paradoxical time to be making this argument about the future of mass human migrations because we were locked down. But if you think about that particular moment, the COVID lockdown, a lot of people treated it like a permanent condition. And God knows it did go on too long, right? But it wasn't permanent. But compare that brief moment in time of the COVID lockdown to the power of these forces, and tell me which one tips the scale. Right? A temporary pandemic lockdown, or forces like demographic imbalances, civil wars and conflicts, economic crises, climate change. Which one is ultimately going to drive human behavior? It's obviously these, right? So maybe this is a great reset moment, right? A term that people use in many different contexts, and maybe we can measure pre versus post-COVID mobility. And you'll actually see some very interesting things happen. For one thing, interestingly enough, it's data so recent that I didn't yet make a slide about it. But according to the United Nations, international migration, or the number of people who live outside their country of origin, has steadily risen and increased even during 2020 and 2021. And when I saw that data just a couple of weeks ago, I did an absolute double take. I was like, how is that even possible? And yet it was. So actually, even this great lockdown wasn't necessarily a lockdown for the whole world, right? People were still moving. People were being driven away from their homes because of climate disasters, for example, or obviously because of political unrest. People were leaving countries or communities where COVID was not well managed in search of better healthcare systems and so on and so forth. So underneath the radar, behind the headlines, we've always been moving. We can't stop moving. People will always search for a better life and opportunity wherever or however they can. So I want to focus on two of the big drivers in particular in this conversation, though obviously we can come back to some of the big geopolitical questions that we're facing right now, obviously, and I'm very, very open to that. But I want to focus on climate and demographics. because we're very familiar with really the 20th century history of politics and economics driving migration. Again, just think of World War II and think of mass migrations into the United States as we expanded our labor market, right? So we generally understand people moving because they're politically oppressed or because they're seeking a better life economically. We're less familiar with mass migrations that may unfold as a result of climate change or this current wave of accelerated climate change, which is, of course, relatively new, and the very new demographic conditions which we're facing right now, which is a sort of deceleration of global population growth. These are two very unprecedented things, and they're going to have a huge impact on mobility, so I want to focus on those. So here we have, again, that map of, again, our sort of present distribution of the 8 billion of us around the world. And what I love about, again, maps like this and the other ones is that geography doesn't lie, I like to say. Politics is untrustworthy, Twitter is not trustworthy, but what I've always loved about geography is that maps can be used as a propaganda tool, but geography itself, this sort of depiction of the empirical world as it is, doesn't lie to you. And it can also be used, of course, as art, in a way, a picture that tells 1,000 words. And that's what some of the maps that I'm going to show you right now really do. So here you have, again, this sort of profound depiction of our world population. This is where we are. But now I want you to look really closely over the next 5 seconds. I'm layering in something for you here. This is called the Suitability Index. The Suitability Index was generated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other climate authorities that are looking at the extent to which places become more or less suitable for human habitation as temperatures rise from 1 degree Celsius higher than the 1990 baseline, 2 degrees, and likely beyond. And you see some pretty profound changes in the map. So there's a couple of points that are worth, or observations that are worth making here. If you remember the previous map and this one, you will note that most of the world's population today, right now, lives in places that are becoming increasingly red. Red doesn't mean you cannot exist there, but it does mean that it's certainly less comfortable, becoming less comfortable, less suitable for habitation. Green, meanwhile, if you notice the contrast from the previous map, these are all countries that are depopulating, including our own right here. Today, the wealthy countries of the world, the OECD members, the United States, Canada, European countries, some Eastern European countries, Japan, Korea, and so forth, are all depopulating. We've reached more or less, our peak fertility, our peak population, absent immigration. Were it not for immigration and the birth rate of immigrants, our population would actually be shrinking right now. And that's true of pretty much every wealthy country in the entire world. So I would challenge anyone to present a more profound paradox, a greater irony in the entire world today than this. The fact that the majority of the world population lives in places that are becoming less and less livable over time, and the places that are becoming more suitable for human life have fewer and fewer people. Does that make any sense to anyone? And on this map, I didn't draw in the borders, right? But of course they're there and they're profound, and all of the infrastructures either for the sake of sort of simplicity. But geologists, climate scientists speak about the climate niche, right? That the optimal band of latitudes that again is most propitious for agriculture and that is really largely determined where most people have settled. The majority of the world population, for example, lives between, or the largest, the most populous band of latitude is between 10 and 20 degrees north latitude, for example. But as that climate niche shifts, as you can see it shifting, people will likely move as well. But we don't have a system for that, right? We don't have a playbook. We don't have a roadmap. The IPCC doesn't tell us how to handle that. It just tells us that this is happening. The United Nations, the Biden administration, the Chinese government, no one is preparing for what might happen as this unfolds and what kinds of changes it's going to necessitate in terms of our human geography. And this map and seeing this sort of scientific reporting and scenarios and projections is definitely one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, to say, you know what, we're really at a crossroads here, right? You know, we have this, we're sort of confronted with this new reality and don't have a plan for how we're going to go about untangling it. We're focused very much in our climate diplomacy on mitigation, right, which is very important. Right, putting resources into greening supply chains and decarbonizing industries, maybe even launching geoengineering schemes to block solar radiation, all of these kinds of things. But we're not focused that much, we're not putting nearly enough money into the here and now of adaptation. Right? What about all of the suffering that populations are enduring right now? And that's everywhere in the world. It's rich countries and poor countries. It's Australia and it's the United States. This can include measures like climate proofing our coastal areas. It could be reducing what's called the urban heat island. Our built-up infrastructure makes things hotter than they need to be, so to speak. And even thinking about new designs for our cities, for our buildings, and even potentially making them more mobile to cope with climate risks. And of course, thinking about large-scale population resettlement. That side of the ledger, that whole right side column, gets about 5% of the money that's committed to confronting climate change. 95% goes over here. Now, I'm for 10x spending on this side and 100x on this side, right? So that it's balanced. That's what we need to be. More of everything, more of all of these necessary steps. But we're not doing that yet. But the models are not, they're not just conjecture. Right? You know, they give us a good sense of what's happening to the world and what places are more or becoming more or less, again, likely to or suitable to absorb larger populations. So what I've done is in my travels to kind of, you know, examine and explore these places and look not only at whether or not they're climatically sort of stable, but also what would large-scale migrations mean for their politics? Can they handle it? What about their economies? Are they going to harness larger populations to diversify their economies? Culturally, right, of course, as well. You know, what does it mean for identity and belonging and all of these things? For a place to be able to absorb large new populations, it's not just about whether or not you're going to be safe from extreme meteorological events. There's a whole lot more that goes into it. So I try to create kind of holistic profiles of places. You know, if you look at a place like Canada and the Great Lakes region, which are certainly climate propitious, well, we have right now very different migration policies on both sides of the border. Right? Canada has emerged as probably the most generous country in the world, pound for pound, in terms of net inward migration. Right? 400,000 people are coming in every single year, which amounts to 1% of their population, which is quite incredible. Europe, you'll notice, is further north, right, than the United States is by latitude. So New York shares the same latitude as Rome, for example, right? So most of Europe is more at the Canadian latitude. So that puts the U.S. very much, you might even say, at the front lines of climate change among advanced economies. We can't ignore climate change here just because we don't see our peer wealthy nations not suffering, you know, some of the effects of climate change the way we are. Our latitude is fundamentally different. Our latitude makes climate change much more relevant in the near term for us than it does for other countries. And I'll dive into those maps of the U.S. in more detail. But in the book, what I do is kind of profile some of these places that I imagine as being new civilizational centers, Because again, human demographics, human migration is always unfolding, and the places that populations may settle and will thrive, in the next 10, 20, 30, or 100 years aren't necessarily going to be the same ones of today. And we don't have to necessarily just imagine what and where those are going to be. We can pretty concretely map them out. In fact, we can even see the growth in some of these places today. So I dwell in the book on places like Canada, whose population is going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And on parts of Europe, where the politics tell you one thing, but the demographics tell you another, because they too are experiencing large-scale inward migrations. And I look at parts of Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, that are actually sort of what I call climate oases, and people are actually pouring in from all parts of Asia into those geographies. I look at Japan, for example, another place that we don't think of as we think of it as the polar opposite of an immigrant society, and yet today there have never been as many foreigners living in Japan as there are actually right now. That doesn't make it a melting pot, right? Japan's not going to be like America, but you also would have laughed at me if 20 years ago I said there'd be 3 million non-Japanese people living in Japan, and yet that's exactly what has happened. So not all of these places are going to be, you shouldn't look at this and say, well, now I know exactly where I'm going to buy some land and property, right? We'd have to go into a little bit more detail in order to make confident predictions about that. But it is worth looking at some of the places that don't have a lot of people today, that will have a lot of people tomorrow. And that is more than just a thought experiment. It's something that I think we should actually prepare for if we want to properly adapt to climate change. And again, that's something that, as I said, is a significant issue for the United States. This is a map generated by a study called the Climate Impact Study, and what it did was to forecast the impact of rapid climate change scenario on the United States by county in terms of the impact on GDP. And places that are yellow and orange represent places where the GDP of that location is likely to contract by 10% or more by 2040. And places that are sort of purple and black, those economies will grow by 10 or 15% versus above and beyond their kind of baseline growth as a result of new patterns of settlement and so forth, and a wide range of other kind of characteristics. So this is, again, pretty significant. There isn't, as I said, we amongst developed economies are kind of at the front lines. This is a fairly profound shift that may take place if we don't adapt accordingly. Now, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about deindustrialization of the Rust Belt and the outsourcing of labor or in the recent decades, and that pushing people away from the north and the east towards the south and the west. You can see that right here in this chart generated by William Frey, a great demographer at the Brookings Institution in DC. He showed that over the last century, the percentage of the U.S. population that actually lives in the south and the west has grown at the expense of the populations of the north and the east. Now, let me just go back for a second. Paradoxical move, right? Somewhat curious choice of direction. If you were to layer in climate into the economic or political calculations, you wouldn't necessarily be moving in these directions. So the climate scientists are saying, hold on a minute, sure, economics is driving people, for certain reasons, but it's driving them in the wrong directions if you look at things from a climate standpoint. And so you have a lot of headlines like this, I'm sure, as you consume the same daily news media that I do. There's a lot of warning signs kind of flashing. But if you tie together, again, the economics, the demographics, and the climate, the fact that so much of Americans' wealth is tied up, of course, in their homes, with the risk to those homes, this is something that we want to get ahead of, right? We don't want to be passive about this. We want to be active about this. And so, but that's not the way our political system actually operates. And it seems to me, I mentioned this term earlier, climate niche. in which the latitudinal bands of stability sort of move. Well, that climate niche is shifting, and so we too have to think about how we settle and locate. And this is what I call the climate migration infrastructure sort of nexus. Right now, the way our fiscal policy is made and our capital allocation is done is kind of based, of course, on political whims and considerations and priorities, pork barrel spending, whatever you want to call it. But what you want to be doing is looking at the climate models and what they tell us about what are the most stable geographies where we know that over the coming decades populations can thrive without great risk of harm from climate change. And then you want to start to incentivize migration into those places. And then you want to make your long-term infrastructure investments focusing on those places rather than others. So for example, right now, if you look at, say, Louisiana's population is declining, but the infrastructure is being battered by all of these Gulf storms and so on. And the state grid, Entergy, spends about, or gets grants, federal grants, 800 million plus a year to rebuild power lines. And those power lines are built to withstand Category 3 storms, but they get Category 4 storms, more than one season a year. And so you're literally throwing, good money after bad projects while the population is declining. It's kind of the exact opposite of what you want to be doing with your precious money. You want to be saying, look, some places are no longer going to be livable. People don't want to live there anyway. Let's start to encourage them to resettle in places where they can have productive, safe, thriving economic and social lives, and focus our infrastructure spending there. Again, that's not, we're doing things almost backwards right now. So it's no surprise to me when young people say, I'm not sure I want to own a home because it may get, destroyed in the next hurricane, or it's too expensive anyway and interest rates are rising, and I'm not even sure where my next job is going to be, so why would I buy a house somewhere and be saddled with debt? So one of the interesting things that happened during COVID, which some of you may or may not have noticed, is that trailer homes became a really, really hot-selling item. In fact, Thor Industries, which makes some of these camper vans, sold out for a while. And I sympathize with young people who say, I'm just not sure where I'm going to be anymore. I'm going to be mobile. I'm going to purchase literally a mobile home. And that's a trend among young people in Europe as well and in other parts of the world. So now I want to transition to that demographic part of the conversation, because I'm emphasizing young people's behavior. And if we're calling this evening the Futurist Edition, and we're going to talk about the future, we need to talk about the people who will inhabit the future, and those are the young people. And we need to put ourselves in their shoes and think about their behavior. And this is where I get into that second sort of key driver of the future of mobility, not just climate change, but demographics. Because we have been very jealously guarding of our sovereignty, of our borders, of restrictive immigration policy and all of these things, partially because we feared a world population that was going to just run amok. Even as recently as 25 years ago, many people predicted a world population that would reach 14, 15 billion people. Well, that's actually not what we need to worry about. That's not what's going to happen. In fact, probably in the next 10 to 12 years, we're going to reach what I call peak humanity, right? And we're going to reach that maximum number of human beings that will ever simultaneously be alive. And that number may not even be 10 billion people. And as I mentioned before, most countries, in the most wealthy countries, are already at peak humanity right now. So we're there. If Africa's population grows by another 500 million people or even 1 billion people, you're not really necessarily going to notice here. Right? We are already in this country at that peak humanity. And the world as a whole is already there in many ways, because actually even in Africa and in Asia, fertility is falling very, very rapidly because of urbanization, female empowerment, economic stress, and also the baby bust of COVID. Right? I think when we look back at the global financial crisis, most people think about it purely on the basis of the economic shock to the system. But one of the things that happened actually during the GFC is that fertility actually declined because of the economic insecurity. Now, we definitely associate COVID with this term baby bust. I think everyone is aware that that the number of Americans born every year dropped suddenly by a few 100,000 just in from 2020 to 2021 alone, and that COVID baby bust continues right now as we speak, and probably into the future. So it's not just that the COVID baby bust is so much more severe than the global financial crisis baby bust was. It's that we've had two of these baby busts back to back in just a decade. And as a result of that, we've really accelerated this plateau in the world population. It's coming much sooner than we thought. It's so severe, this COVID baby bust, that Generation Alpha, which is today's toddlers and still unborn children until the year 2025, when we reconvene in 2026, and we know the full size of Generation Alpha across the whole planet Earth, it will probably be that dashed line. It'll actually probably be smaller than Gen Z. So all of us are familiar with the last 100 years in which the world population quadrupled from 2 billion people in 1920 to 8 billion people by 2020. So it's very, very hard for us to wrap our heads around the idea of peak humanity, right? None of us can conceivably relate to it, and yet here we are. And requires a profoundly new psychology in terms of thinking about the distribution of people. Economic growth, you could always count on just juicing an economy by having more children be born. Of course, you want to have technology and labor productivity and all of those things as well, which we've also had. But we're not going to squeeze any more growth out of a declining population, obviously. So Gen Z will wind up being the largest generation of human beings, literally, that our species has ever produced. Gen Alpha will be smaller, and then they'll get smaller and smaller from there, because our children aren't having children, or our grandchildren aren't having as many children as we have across the entire world. And so that's how this decline is starting to happen. Now, the human population can either fall or taper gradually or precipitously, right? We don't know which path it's going to be. That's going to depend on a lot of things, including, of course, whether or not the young people of today, live in stable environments, politically, socially, economically, and environmentally, and feel that it is their desire to have children. Right now, that's not the case, and I'm not sure that people fully appreciate the extent to which every country in the world that has tried to raise fertility has failed to do so. Right? So because, again, of economic stress, environmental consciousness, there are many surveys of young people in terms of why they don't want to have children, and there are many of these causes that are named, and I don't think that that their minds are going to be changed. But let me get to the final point here, which is really how this all becomes kind of sci-fi-like, because we're accustomed to a world in which the world population is rapidly growing, but instead we have a situation where the young people who represent the largest share of the world population today, if they're not having kids, that means that they're the present and they're also the future. The future is smaller than the present, right, demographically. So the present is the future. Again, we've never been in a situation like that ever. And that's where we are right now. There's no roadmap for this, just like there's no roadmap for the climate issue, which is why we have to really think about the world that we are building, the world that we're designing, the world that our politics is driving us towards, versus the situation that our young people are in today. Are we designing the future in a way that's most amenable to the needs of young people? And right now, the answer is we clearly are not. Now, I think this is an interesting point to kind of think a bit sociologically, and this was the part of the research that took me, a bit out of my comfort zone. Normally, when I travel and do interviews, I'm meeting executives and ministers and things like this, and I realized that actually, if I want to write about the human geography of the year 2050, I kind of need to understand what today's 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and 10-year-olds are thinking. So I started doing sort of focus groups and going to high schools, and not the usual subject matter, at least not for my field. And it proved to be really interesting. And I realized, well, the young, they're not like you and me, right? And that's why I wanted to pause for a moment and talk about this sort of notion of we. Who are we? We so often in our speech we say, well, here's what we think, right? Here's what we believe. This is how we think things should be. As well, who is the we? And when the people in this room, myself, often use that plural pronoun, we usually mean that, well, who are we? Well, we are, generally speaking, married households with 2 children and 2-income households, and we live in suburbia in a Western society. But if you take the 8 billion people of the world and you line them up, and you find that median person, right in the middle, that person is nothing like us, right? That person is young, not old. That person is single, unmarried, potentially never getting married, doesn't have children, is financially struggling, doesn't own a home, right? Is renting at best, and certainly doesn't live in a Western country. They live in a developing country in likely a very large megacity. That's like the sort of median human being in the world, and that's the person that we have to have as the center of our attention. What are we doing for that person? Because the further into the future you look, the more that represents an ever larger share of the world population, and we represent an ever smaller share of the population. But again, who runs our systems, and who are the systems built for today? Not for that young person who thinks about climate change, who thinks about sustainability as a priority, connectivity as a human right, mobility as a human right. That's how young people think. Those are their values. This is extremely well documented. As you can well imagine, no generation in history has been as thoroughly psychoanalyzed as millennials and Gen Z, because we read all your Facebook posts and so on. So this is not just airy-fairy make-believe. Whether they're Canadian or Chinese or Nigerian or American or Brazilian, there are exactly 3 common psychological traits among the 4 or 5 billion young people of the world, which is they believe in connectivity, sustainability, and mobility. And again, our systems aren't designed to win them over, right? To make life better for them. We're not focused on their opportunity, on their skill building, on work-life balance, and so on and so forth. But we need to be if we want them to procreate, right? If we want to have a stable world population in the future. But there's a lot of things that we can do to promote that, and those involve thinking about technology to enable mobility. In the end, I'm an advocate for greater mobility because mobility is our best defense. It's our fight or flight sort of instinct that kicks in to stresses, whether it's political stress or ecological stress. And we can ensure that young people are more mobile through more digital services, by unlocking their ability to afford to live in either in this society or in other societies. We can make international mobility itself more easy to achieve by reducing the kind of penalty of citizenship based upon where people are born, and focusing more on skills-based migration and on bridging labor shortages and gaps and all of those kinds of things. So I do think that coming out of COVID, we want to think about the role of technology, not just digital connectivity, but unlocking physical mobility through all of the new platform technologies that we have. And I'm advocating, therefore, that we think about rectifying, again, through the environmental challenges that we face and the demographic shortages that we have through large-scale migration, but that can still be done in a controlled way. Now, a lot of people say, you're positing or even urging us to absorb large numbers of migrants in a world of mass migration. That seems unmanageable. How will we ever cope with this radically new scenario? Say, well, wait a minute. That's what we've been doing for the last 300 years, right? In fact, if you think about it, what we've shown in the last few hundred years is that we're really bad at maintaining global peace. We're really bad at mitigating inequality, and we're really bad at managing the environment. But we're really damn good at mass migration, right? It's maybe the thing that we as the countries of the West in particular have done the best in the last few hundred years. So part of me wants to say, shh, let's not spoil the good thing that we've been doing. In fact, the winning societies of the last several hundred years, most especially, of course, the United States, have been the places that have absorbed the most migrants. So mass migration, even at the scale that I'm describing, isn't necessarily all that new, and we're really, really good at it. So we have to remember that that it's a part of history, it's a feature of history. It's going to unfold for all the reasons it has in the past, but amplified potentially because of the demographic imbalances and climate change and conflict and so forth. But it's an opportunity. It's something that we need right now. If you think about our labor shortages and everything from childcare to construction, it's inflationary, of course, to have these shortages. And so part of the reason we're paying higher prices for everything is also because we don't have the right demographic balance. And there's tools, diplomatic tools, to achieve this. As countries use data to understand what their gaps are, which countries can fill those gaps, whether, again, it's nurses, caregivers, IT workers, and so forth. So countries are engaging in these skills partnerships. So whereas the headlines tell us that Marine Le Pen is a xenophobe and is a candidate for president of France, as she was until last week, and Western societies will never accept mass migration and so forth. In fact, actually, under the radar, what countries are doing is engaging in these very professional processes to identify what their shortages are and bring them in. So Canada is doing it, Germany is doing it, the UK is doing it, Japan is doing it. So in fact, rather than this narrative that the world is run by populists and xenophobes and anti-immigrant sentiment, in fact, that's not true. That's not true at all. And of course, here, we're ground zero for that, because even though we've had the last few years of low migration, Congress is forecasting that this year about 1 million new migrants will come into the United States. 1 million. Now, there's only one country in the world that goes from low migration because of COVID and Trumpism, below 200,000 as the figure the last couple of years, to 1 million. Right? Only this country can do that. And that's actually going to be a positive source of energy and dynamism for the economy. So all is not lost. But again, you can't be completely confident about what direction the future is going in. Things just get more and more complex at the intersection of these geographies. And so in the end, this is not necessarily, I try to be optimistic and positive in the book, but I fundamentally build it around or constructed around 4 scenarios about the future. And the thing about scenario planning is that all of these 4 images, if you will, are already true. They're already happening. And in the future, 20 years from now, they will still be true. The question is where? In which part of the world is which scenario playing out with what intensity? Because regional fortresses, I constructed these scenarios along the axes of sustainability versus migration, and regional fortresses kind of looks like today. We're doing more to invest in our own sustainability as Europe is as well, but we're very, very cautious about migration. There's parts of the world like the U.S.-Mexico border or the Mediterranean Sea that resemble the New Middle Ages or the barbarians at the gate scenario, sort of uncontrolled attempts at migration and societies dislocated because of climate effects and conflict and even water wars and things like this. So that's already happening today. And then there's the Northern Lights scenario, which is the one that I ultimately advocate for, obviously, in which we bring about a peaceful, gradual, necessary resettlement of large population groups, and we do so in ways that benefit our own economies and our own social sort of our own social dynamism, but we also do so sustainably. We have all the technologies at our disposal today, 3D printed housing and rainwater collection, wastewater treatment, water desalination, nuclear energy, you name it, to achieve this vision. And there are already countries, again, like Canada and others that are already pursuing this path. In the way I see it, there's 2 kinds of countries in the world: those that have realized that they need to engage in a war for young talent in particular, right, to untangle these geographic knots, to make the most of to overcome the demographic shortages and adapt to climate change and deal with our demographic sort of free fall at the same time, means that you want to be vigorously competing to attract young people to be a healthy, stable, robust society for the future. And so there's two kinds of countries, those that realize that and those that haven't. And the ones that have realized it are the ones that are going to be the winners in the future, for sure. Because in a world that's depopulating, demographics become zero-sum, right? You're either collecting people or you're losing people. And you don't want to be in the countries that are losing people. Those are not going to be the healthier, dynamic, entrepreneurial societies of the future. Collecting people is collecting power in some ways, and I think that we want to continue to do that. So ultimately, the model that I'm advocating in the Northern Lights scenario is also what I call Civilization 3.0, a world that is more mobile, a population that's more mobile, but also more sustainable at the same time. And there are two things we can do to achieve that world. One is either you move people to where the resources are. The other thing you can do is move technologies to where the people are that need them. One of those two things. That's what the solution ultimately boils down to. And I think that everyone should be asking themselves in our professional lives, in our charitable contributions, in our civic engagement, in our international thinking and outreach, are we doing one of those two things? Right? Are we helping shift people to resources or moving technologies to people? If you're not doing one of those two things, you should think about why you're not or how you can. And that ultimately is how we're going to get to that world that is more prosperous, more sustainable, and by way of becoming more mobile at the same time. So that's a hopeful vision for the future that I wanted to present to you this evening. And I want to thank you again for having me here with you, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Thank you. All right, here we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. If we can have the lights up a little bit, we have some time for Q&A. And I'll just come down here and see if anyone has any questions. You can raise your hand if you do. There's a question over there.
What about the animals?
That's a great question. Well, so I guess that would fall in the category of biodiversity. I don't want to give like a rigid academic answer, but there's a deep concern, obviously, with other mammal species and other life forms, and how important it is for us to manage our ecosystems, of which they're such an important part. And I think that not many countries are doing a good job of that. Part of it falls within the orbit of sort of conservation efforts, right? So, for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of E.O. Wilson, right? The late sociobiologist, I guess, is the term that he invented, actually, and that best characterizes his work. And one of his final books was called Half Earth, right? It was about how we need to designate these contiguous zones for rewilding, so that not only would the natural habitats, but also the animal habitats be able to thrive and coexist, and we would sort of steer clear, if you will, of those. And those would help. They would serve as carbon sinks, but also allow for the animals to play the vital role that they do in our ecosystems. And I think that that's the kind of thinking that integrates our own geography with the natural geography, with the rest of the animal kingdom very well. And that was very practical wisdom, that he shared. But unfortunately, I don't see a lot of countries putting that balance, that biodiversity balance front and center the way they should.
Thank you. I think we have some questions over here.
Two questions, I guess. Number one is, what's the time frame on those four quadrants that you showed on your last slide there, the barbarians and the Northern Lights? And the other was, like, do you have kids, and what the hell do you talk about at dinner?
Well, I'll take the latter one first. I mean, my kids go to international school, and they're in the IB program. So this is what they talk about at school all the time. So in a way, they were interview subjects. This is the first book for which I felt like my kids were making a genuine contribution to the research with their own activism, and that's having Gen Z kids. In a way, really sort of helps helped me to think about the future from that bottom-up point of view in many ways. Though I obviously also did more rigorous research than just hang out with my own kids. But no, they're a part of it for sure. And they've been beneficiaries, of course, of mobility, right? Born here and living in many different countries and so on. And that almost effortless mobility that they get to enjoy, privileged as they are, is certainly more common today than it was during the Cold War. Right, and I think that's again, it's not, the world has more borders, right, than it's ever had before, but it also has more opportunities for mobility than it's ever had before. And I think again, in terms of the scenarios, it's actually really interesting because these visioning exercises help people of whatever age, think about what kind of world do they want, what kind of world do they want to build, and appreciate that again, all of those quadrants are true at the same time. So in terms of the time frame, again, that when you properly design a scenario, it's already true. So in part of the answer to your question is the time frame is today, right? All of that was happening. But if we were to teleport into 2050, you would find places in the world that still resemble that medieval scenario, and you'd parts of the world that resemble the scenario of, again, violent confrontation over resources. And you'd have places that were fortress-like, and then you'd have places where you would had enjoyed a peaceful recirculation of people in, let's say, the Arctic region, and new enclaves that will have formed, and so forth. All of those will be true at the same time. So that's the important thing about scenarios. They have to be plausible and realistic now and in the future, at any point in the future.
I'd like to get some of our Carmel High School students back there.
I read your book recently, and my favorite chapter was the one where you talked about the new American dream. I was drawn to examining that idea ever since I took a U.S. history course. You talk about how increasingly dangerous crises, climate crises, other things, will cause people to move to these more sustainable areas or even just more survivable areas. But the American populace is notoriously set in their ways, especially. Do you think that people will rally and move out of dangerous areas, or will most people realize the problem only when it's upon them?
So you mean specifically with respect to the climate threat, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is, at this moment, one of the more dangerous and immediately problematic things that we're facing. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Our population shifts, are driven by a lot of these different factors. Right now, people will move out of areas where crime is rising. They'll move out of areas where, again, jobs have been lost, where there's economic, sort of deprivation. And then there's, of course, the climate risk. So one of the things that's really different now is that the government is getting more active in this area. So, for example, they're declaring eminent domain on geographies in some parts of the Carolinas and other coastal areas and the Gulf Coast, saying you cannot rebuild here. You're just not allowed to. In the past, it was you get your rebuilding kind of grant, some six-figure amount. You go and spend on rebuilding your home. Now they're saying here's the money, but you can't come back. Right? You got to go live somewhere else. So that's probably the right thing to do because, again, that's taxpayer money. So you want to encourage people to live in stable areas economically. Then opportunity zones. Now, opportunity zones are a big part of our kind of sort of future legislation or emerging legislation right now, and that's generally focused on trying to drive investment into underprivileged or deprived areas. I'm arguing that we should add a climate layer to that, right? So incentivize people to move, again, to these climate resilient places. Generally speaking, though, again, in a volatile world, even a volatile country, quite frankly, you, especially, again, young people, can't say with the certainty that we, the older people, used to have, where we said, well, I know that I'm going to live here. This is where I'm going to buy my house, build my life, stay in this town, for generations or decades. So that's why in that chapter I said the old American dream was a home and a degree. And the new American dream is mobility and skills, right? The capacity to move to wherever the opportunity is, and the desire to constantly be skilled, not to view a degree as a terminal skill. So not just a home and a degree, mobility and skills. And we need to invest in that mobility is both physical and, of course, social. And in fact, the best pathway to the social mobility that we think of as intrinsic to the American dream is also physical mobility. And part of the stubbornness that you were describing is that many people in the country are sort of stuck in place. There were generations in American history, most of American history, where year on year, decade on decade, a large percentage of the American population moved and relocated. Just think, obviously, about the westward expansion that brought a huge population out here to California. But ever since, or in recent decades, Americans became more sort of stuck in place, and we need to get unstuck. Particularly the people that are in socially deprived areas or environmentally stressed areas.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. A few years ago, one of our local authors wrote a book called Watchman's Rattle. Are you familiar with it?
I heard about it this evening for the first time.
Oh,
in fact.
okay.
Yeah.
And that book talked about the evolution of societies and the decline of all the great civilizations of our world. And the reason those civilizations declined was because of the increasing complexity of every society and the inability of leaders to make decisions that didn't have second, third, fourth order implications because of the intense complexity. Mm-hmm. Could you comment on how do we deal with complexity from a political perspective? Because obviously those people are making decisions.
That's an excellent summary of the argument. There's a great literature around civilizational collapse, why civilizations have collapsed, particularly Mayan civilization, for example, and others. And the causes are many. There are definitely ecological origins, for example, but also man-made ones that relate to the environment. So, overexploitation of farmland and forest areas, combined with some meteorological event, but certainly social complexity as well that failed, that over-bureaucratized, even in those days and ages, and therefore failed to sort of maintain growth and dynamism, and so they collapsed. So what would be the opposite of complexity would be simplicity. Right, so what can we do here to be less reliant on foreign energy imports, foreign food, foreign technology, and foreign investment, and those kinds of things? And every country is starting to think that way in light of a range of phenomena. U.S.-China tensions and tariffs, COVID and supply chain breakdown. A lot of these things have been pushing us over the last decade in particular. You can really go back about maybe 15 years, actually. The shale energy revolution in North America really, sort of gained steam over the past decade. And that has meant that we have total energy self-sufficiency. We are closer to food self-sufficiency than we've ever been. We have demographic self-sufficiency if we continue to bring in the sort of best and the brightest and the segments of the labor force that we need. Let me put it simply. I can say a lot about other regions of the world, but let's focus on ourselves for just a second. There's no other continent that is even remotely as blessed with the conditions. This is like the alley-oop in basketball, right? Like geology, geography, geopolitics have blessed us. We're like, here's the basket and we're right here. Just put the ball in, right? No other place is nearly as close to being self-sufficient and untangling that complexity as we are. We just have to do it. So no other place has the water resources, the energy resources, the food resources, the industry, the people, the technology. That's your laundry list of things that you need in one place to not need the rest of the world. We're already by far the least trade dependent of powers. You wouldn't want to be Germany right now. That depends on exports to China, Russia, and other places, right? We don't depend on exports of those places. We do export to them, but we don't depend on it. Less than 14% of our GDP is even related to trade in any way, whereas with other countries it can be 60 or 70%. So we're like really, really close, believe it or not. And yet we also get in our own way. Right? We make things a lot more complicated than they need to be, but that should be the prize that we have our eyes on.
So can you tell me, in the Northern Lights structure, what would you view as the governance structure, or would there be one?
That is a fantastic question, because there is no global governance of migration. It's the one thing that will probably never have global governance, because in a way, we've ceded sovereignty over so many things. I mean, for one thing, you can't control the flow of pathogens and viruses and cyber attacks and pollution across borders, but you can still control the movement of people, right? So when all that's left of your state, of stateness, is controlling your borders against the movement of people, that will be the one thing that countries will hold on to. So you'll never have a global migration accord per se, but you'll have bilateral pairs of countries that cooperate on this issue, right? So it'll be, again, Canada saying, we're going to take each year 100,000 people from India and X number of people from Mexico and from the United States as well. It'll be Germany saying, we're going to take this many Ukrainians and Russians and people from the Balkans and people from Africa and people from Syria, and as they did in 2015, 2016. It'll be those kinds of pairings that, in a bottom-up way, result in that net picture of people recirculating, if you will. It won't be top-down. It'll be much more bottom-up. So when you say, what is the governance? The answer is there won't be global governance. It'll be a very kind of ad hoc system. And I wish that we could be more strategic about it, because, again, we can build scenarios where we show what needs to be done. But I don't think that any more than 2 or 3 governments at a time will actually agree on it. So sensitive is the issue that if you think about just the Schengen area, I mean, there's no area of the world where more countries have agreed to be borderless than inside the European Union. But during the financial crisis, countries were worried about unemployed Greeks flooding north, and even Italians. And so Switzerland considered, wasn't part of Schengen anyway, but closing its borders. Even Germany and France considered it as well. During COVID, of course, they said, well, we've got to close our borders. So even countries that really are the pinnacle of openness to each other can always snap back. So I think it's going to be a very, very, very cautious kind of process.
See one over here?
Quick comment and a question. California gets 18% of all of its electricity from hydro and spends 19% of all of its electricity use on moving water around the state. California is a good example of a real disconnect water-wise. We're essentially an arid desert, and yet we don't seem to get it. Is California going to be a watershed when people wake up, and can perhaps California provide leadership?
Well, I don't think that at this point we don't have national leadership on this issue. We have definitely places that are the front lines, like California. California doing what California needs to do for itself will be good leadership in and of itself, given that it's the most important state in the country, or largest by population and GDP. So I'm not going to hold my breath for a national renaissance around water management or energy management, because our grid in any case is not one grid, it's several, and they're variably underperforming, including PG&E and so forth here. I would say, though, that the kinds of things that you would want to see more of, and in a way, again, California leads the country in desalination investment, right? But is it enough? No. And in terms of the diminishing water supply, and the overexploitation of the existing water resources, and I know the price of water has gone up, for example, right here in this area, for example, but is that genuinely leading to conservation and to better management, those are two different things. Simply raising the price doesn't automatically lead to better policy. So, this is one of these rearguard actions. We saw this coming. People have been talking about this for probably 20 years. I think probably Jerry Brown has probably been talking about this for 25 or 30 or 40 years. And now we're saying we need to act on it. That's not, that's bad news. So I do think the capacity is there. I mean, this state actually does have the resources to finance, the remedies. But kind of like the answer to the previous question, we slow ourselves down. We get in our own way politically. But meanwhile, the clock is ticking on issues like water.
Rita, there's a question right there.
Okay. Your book stresses the importance of people all over the globe working together to solve the issues that we as a society are facing. In your opinion, what sort of changes in global leadership do we need to see for this to occur?
I focused a lot in previous books on this question of global governance, and what shape it takes and who the primary actors are and how public-private cooperation is so important, because many corporations have the key investment and technological resources necessary for problem solving. Civic actors obviously do as well, foundations and charities and so forth. And there's ideally global governance is not thought of as just the United Nations, right? And whatever is legislated there, because clearly the United Nations is quite marginal in the grand scheme of things. And that we kind of conceive of new models that are again at this intersection of public, private, and civic. And I think that's kind of what's happening already at a local scale, right, or a regional scale, rather than at a global scale. And that's okay. That's okay so long as it is happening, because we're probably moving into a world that's more regional and less global, right, along the lines of this question about simplifying our global dependencies and reducing complexity and focusing on our own backyard. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last few years, trade within North America, or U.S. trade with Mexico and U.S. trade with Canada has been greater than trade with China. Trade within Europe is greater than its trade with other parts of the world. Even Asians now trade more with Asians than with the rest of the world. So you have these regional systems, and obviously environmentally we have regional systems occurring in energy markets and so forth. So whether or not we have global solutions might be less important than that within each region or country the maximum resources are being devoted to obviously things like decarbonization, right, and other sorts, and producing enough food and so on and so forth. And that's probably the level at which we should be looking. That's not, again, the way we're sort of raised to think. I did a lot of Model UN when I was your age. So, we always thought global solutions mean everything. And I've worked so much with international agencies and organizations, and I no longer look to them as the place that the venues that have the resources and even the thought leadership to provide solutions. I think we need to look much closer to home. But overall, I take kind of like an all hands on deck approach, if you will. If a government is not solving a problem, that doesn't mean that the rest of society can't step in.
Doctor, thank you. Further about governance, I'm curious about this. Will Rogers said that the greatest form of government was dictatorship as long as you had the right dictator. And I want to ask you if democracy, with all of its competing interests and profitabilities or loss, can take on the challenges of this, or does an autocratic regime have a better chance of doing something that needs to be done by dictating it?
Well, I mean, we don't have one global government, either autocratic or democratic, so it's a question of specific societies. And the truth is that there's many high-performing democracies that are doing the right progressive things, presuming that we share the same understanding of what is meant by the right thing. So whether it's, again, Canada or Germany or Japan, even the UK has really backtracked from Brexit. And the UK is incredibly progressive on its green energy strategy, its climate adaptation. It really takes climate adaptation probably way more seriously than most Western countries. And they've even backtracked on Brexit. It's like easier to move to the UK today because they've realized what enormous labor shortages Brexit caused. So despite the buffoonery, of their leadership, they're actually on the right track in many ways. So these are all democracies, that I'm looking at. I wouldn't look at the way China is governed right now and see it as a role model, right? If you think about the suppression of information on COVID and the fact that it's actually come back to bite them right now with looking at the lockdowns and the infection rates and so forth. So the problem is not democracy per se, that democracy can't solve problems. The best governed countries in the world, the role model countries, are still democracies. The question is, to what extent, when they make the right decision, do they lock it in and commit the resources to it in an apolitical way? And that's where there's a real distinction among democracies. And the distinction comes down to, very tangibly, do you have a strong, independent, well-funded civil service? Do you have strong bureaucratic administration that can deploy capital behind the decisions that are made? And you have, within the democracies of the world, a wide spectrum just in answering that question. And the ones that are doing the right things, again, like Germany or Canada or New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, these places fall at the end of the spectrum where they have really strong governments. So here we have democracy, but a less effective government, where resources are not adequately deployed against the scale of the problem. But it didn't used to be that way, right? I mean, particularly through the mid-20th century, as America was building itself out into the superpower that we are, government was large, government was robust, government was effective, government translated decisions into action. That's not what's happening anymore. And the fault isn't just the nature of all democracies, it's us. So this is where it kind of flips things on its head. We've always thought that we need to teach the rest of the world this, that, and the other thing. But this is an area where we could learn a lot from other countries.
A few more questions, I think. More?
Yes, I wanted to thank you so much for your work and for bringing this to us today, and ask you, given the global connection that young people have that you talked about, and the fact that they're more globally focused because of the types of technology they're using, TikTok, et cetera, what type of things do you think we ought to be bringing to the education of these young people who are going to be facing such a staggering change in their lifestyle? Because the thought of having to be that mobile, that you have to move from country to country constantly, is very daunting from someone of my era who also is not living in the country of her birth. It's just a really interesting whole thing of how you bring some education, for example, what you've just shown us, to our young generation so that they have an opportunity to begin to really expand and learn.
It's a great question. I think education is already starting to look very different, but it needs to continue to evolve and not only evolve for those at the kind of cutting edge or frontier, but at a much larger scale. So one of the things to reiterate is that it isn't just education in the sense of one fixed period of time and one degree, right? Sort of, lifelong learning becomes more important than ever. There are countries where they're talking about degrees having expiration dates, right? Because whatever technologies or tools you studied at one point in time will have been superseded. In software programming, that's certainly the case, right? The language in which you learn to code won't be the key language in which people are coding even 5-10 years from now. So that's an example of a skill with an expiration date, so to speak. So you need to refresh that, right? So I think young people need to have that constant opportunity. And then, of course, skills-based or sort of vocational. on the job, if you will, training. And that's starting to change too. Well, first of all, that's the way it's always been in Korea and in Germany and other places, where you've always had a strong alignment between industry, education, government priorities, where they're really forecasting what are the labor market needs, what is the role of our country in the division of labor in the world, and what do we need to train people for, and think 5 years in advance about that and get people upskilled accordingly. So we obviously should be doing a lot more of that as well. So that industry-related, industry-specific, but then that too can change, and so you still need to develop more skills as well. Then the mode of delivery has to change as well. So much more can be digital, right? Not that kids should be sitting in front of the computer on Zoom from the age of 6, but there's lots of content, that can be retrofitted into or shoehorned into the kind of digital format to give people those crash courses that they need. So that's why that's such a huge business model as it is right now. So if we did all of those things, like all of them, right, and for everyone, then you'd have the kind of educational system that is fit for purpose in terms of always scanning for what the 21st century sort of problems are and training people to cope with them accordingly. So you're right that we're still a very long way away, but it's also true that this is a huge area where a lot of work is already being done, and it's good work, and it just needs to be scaled faster.
Last question? Yes?
So throughout your book and your presentation that you just shared with us, you mentioned the impacts of COVID-19 on human geography and global migrational patterns multiple times. And now that we're transitioning out of this global pandemic, how do your ideas on its impacts on migration differ from what you might have originally expected?
It's a wonderful question. It's actually really amplified my view that we're going to see more migration, not less, which is the exact opposite of what people thought during the lockdown. And I'll give you some really, really concrete numbers around that I hope will stick with you, especially young people. Before COVID, there were exactly 2 countries, I think, that had nomad visa programs, right? Today, 75 countries do. So again, I thought we were all supposed to be locked down the last 2 years. Well, there are 75 countries, desirable countries, that said, because of the lockdown, we're not getting the tourists, the business travelers, the conference goers in our country. And this is very bad for our services economies. So let's radically overhaul our immigration system and say, let's have visa on arrival, come and go as you please. But we want human beings in our countries. So 75 countries in the middle of a global lockdown said, what can we do right now to ensure that we get people coming in, that we make migration easier rather than harder, right? That's amazing. That's a trend. That's not a blip. COVID was the blip. The lockdown was the blip. The trend is the realization, again, that countries need people. In a sort of the COVID lockdown that froze some movement made it so blindingly apparent, so painfully apparent to many economies. And that's why today, if you go to Athens, if you go to Lisbon, if you go to Dubai, if you go to Tbilisi, if you go to Bali, if you go to Berlin, do you know what the lingua franca is on the streets of all these places? American English, right? American English. It's you guys, young Americans who are saying, I'm going to take that digital nomad thing. I'm going to take that golden visa, whatever it is, and go live in these places that are affordable, that have good quality of life, where there are startup companies flourishing, where governments are giving out grants. As far as Helsinki, Finland, these 75 countries are out recruiting young, talented people and saying, come and live in our country. If you're fed up with the way COVID was handled in your country, or you don't like the politics of your country. So right now, it is in a way, it's a great time to be a young, skilled person. Every country in the world literally wants you right now, which is again the opposite of that sort of prevailing political narrative of xenophobia and populism. And even if there are countries, like let's say Hungary or Russia, that obviously don't want a lot of migrants right now, and people don't necessarily want to go there either. Don't you worry, because pretty much all the good countries in the world are desperate to have you go. So there's never been a better time to be an educated young person than right now, because not only, I myself remember spending, $300 on this visa and $400 on that visa, and waiting online and standing outside embassies and consulates in New York and DC and going back and forth and filling out forms and all this stuff. That's all gone for you. Right? And not just if you have an American passport, or a Japanese passport or a French passport. It's pretty much for any person that can document that they have a college degree or, some good professional track record. All of this stuff is digitized now. It's all, and COVID has helped that process. So again, the post-COVID landscape of migration for young people is going to be way different. It already is instantly. And this is the beautiful thing about even some of these questions about governance. Our governance is so bad because of inertia, right? In other words, we do things the way we do them because that's how we've been doing them. Not because it has to be so bad, right? We don't have to line up at embassies and consulates and spend all this money. It can all be on the blockchain. It can all be an app. I advocate passports should just be an app, right? You upload your data, your fingerprints, your retinal scan, your criminal history, financial statements, educational certifications, send the file over to, fill-in-the-blank.gov, and they scan it, approve it, boom, you get a e-visa. We had that technology 5 years ago. We just didn't do it. But we are doing it now. It's happening literally right now, and it's because of COVID. So this will be a great silver lining and a benefit, and it will especially benefit young people. So again, to conclude, it's the war for young talent, right? Countries realizing they need young people, countries making it easier for young people to go there, and the winners are going to be the ones that make it the easiest. And we want to be one of those countries.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And if you would like to purchase a book, we will have Parag in the lobby right now. Thank you. Have a beautiful evening. Take care. Bye.